Hello, everybody. I just wanted to give you a quick update. You've probably noticed that I haven't posted the podcast for the last couple of weeks, and that was because there was a change in the software that I used to create the podcast that wouldn't allow me to export the audio or video. I have discovered a workaround, so we are back in business. And I just sent my second book to the publisher, so we can look, hopefully you can look for a 40-day devotional on marriage skills soon. And that's it for the update. Enjoy the rest of this podcast. We are excited that we have hit podcast number 50. Hi, welcome to Little Pieces Club Ministries podcast. My name is Chris Polad. I'm known as Mr. Chris to the kids at Little Pieces Club small groups. I am a Bible nerd, a child of divorce, and author, and I created Little Pieces Club Ministries around the idea that when our hearts break, God can still make works of art from the broken pieces. I run small groups for children and teens and consult with and support parents. I also give lectures and seminars on request. The content centers around the science of adversity, abuse, and neglect, or ACE science, and how biblical design patterns harmonize with it. We are non-doctrinal and base our teachings on biblical scholarship. And along the way of this path, I discovered that Jesus' story, wrapped in the design patterns of the Good Shepherd and Tree of Life, help us process, grieve, forgive, and reintegrate our souls after trauma and relational toxicity. This helps us grow strong in solitude and community, and leading us and helps us love God, self, and others, which happen to be the most important blessings we can experience and give. The podcast is geared to help parents understand their children's point of view and to be a good shepherd and tree of life through the hard times. I've started a new series of short videos called God Questions in Context with Dr. Chris. I tweet this out and share it on Instagram, and it can be found on our YouTube channel. You can connect with us at www.littlepiecesclub.com. You can send us an email at littlepiecesministries@gmail.com, and then follow us on socials at LPC Ministries for Instagram, at Club Pieces on Twitter, and at Little Pieces Club on TikTok. We also have a YouTube video channel to look at all of our small groups and the videos that accompany the podcasts. We also have a Facebook site as well. So now let's get into this week's episode. So we are celebrating our 50th episode today with our part 2 of Parent FAQs for Little Pieces Club Ministries. And we just want to take a minute to remind our audience what context we're talking through. We are taking cutting-edge science regarding abuse, neglect, adversity, and resilience, and merging it with the deep biblical design patterns that we can see when we look through original context in the Bible. And a couple patterns in particular that we like to talk about are the Good Shepherd and Tree of Life, which includes a progression from lost sheep to Good Shepherd that can then acknowledge the fact that there are bad sheep and bad shepherds, and that we also use the concept of Tree of Life to represent our journey in solitude and our journey in community that grows and matures over time. And we have a slide that's not exhaustive, but it talks about our general curriculum that we put out that can be followed in small group or with individual study to gain more mastery over these different types of skills. So again, they exist in solitude and then also community. Finally, one other thing that is running in the background that we briefly touch upon is the idea of attachment. And that's our ability to securely and lovingly bond with men and women as we grow. And this sets in around ages 6 months to 18 months. So it's long before our organized memories take shape. And so what was happening in our early environments in this time frame is going to reflect in our attachments until we reach the point where we can take a little bit more control and take the reins of ourselves in our maturity and realize that attachment patterns can grow and change over time. So it's not something that's fixed, but it's something, if we're not aware of, will deeply affect our relationships moving forward. So parenting FAQ number 1 for today: frequently asked questions or things that come up as I've walked with different divorced families over the years. And probably one of my biggest concerns and a driving force behind why I do Little Pieces Club Ministries is this question: why are people kicked out of church for getting a divorce? And this is extraordinarily unfortunate. And if we just stop and think a moment about the Good Shepherd idea, kicking someone out of a church for getting a divorce is akin to taking a lost sheep and kicking them off the path. And so it grates against people when we ask about this, and really shows this kind of allegiance to rules rather than relationship. So we're going to talk through this for a few minutes here, and hopefully come to some principles that we can use moving forward. So as I said, I've walked with a number of people and heard others tell me about friends who have been kicked out of churches when a divorce happened. In one case that I know, it's fueled a long-term bitterness towards all things church and God related. So we're going to talk through this, and I will help develop for you the LPC approach to this question. And anytime that we run into something like this, when something like this is sort of a rule, it's helpful to start way back to the idea of the 10 Commandments, because most of us in the Western church kind of think about these 10 basic rules that we use to kind of lay down our faith journey. But I'm going to kind of alter that a little bit right now and realize that when we talk about these 10 Commandments, the idea is way more nuanced than we're ever led to believe in the Western church. But first, I want to lay down a metaphor to help us. So let's visualize a rocky, mountainous path, one where sometimes the drops are steep and dangerous, and at other times, if you fall off the path, it's easier to hop back on it. Now, if God created this path, it seems reasonable for him to tell people about the risks and benefits of staying on the path and how to stay on the path. And if we just really quickly think about the Garden of Eden, God gave Adam and Eve some rules about making sure they stay in the garden by not eating of a certain tree. So we can see that this idea is running from the very beginning of the Bible. So further, if people are not perfect and step off the path, it seems reasonable that God, the Father, tells people how to get back on the path. So some of you may see where this is kind of going. The path are the rules and laws of the created world. For instance, gravity is easily observed, and this would be akin to God taking responsibility for gravity, saying, if you step off a cliff, I will let you fall. Well, that's maybe God metaphorical language saying, hey, don't step off the cliff because the way that I created the world, it's going to hurt you. So this might be one of the ways that the biblical authors are choosing to communicate the reality that choices have consequences. So if you eat of that fruit, you will surely die, as I said, is another example. Further, when we discuss the 10 Commandments, the major east-west dichotomy is in the word commandment and how it's translated. The basic word is mitzvah, and this is actually a blessing. So thus we can read the so-called commandments this way, and they change from rules and laws to something else completely. So with our metaphor in tow, we can say in order to be blessed and to bless others, to stay on the path, you should. So remember, you should, greatest blessings, love others as yourself, and love God. And then, of course, all of the 10 commandments. You are blessed and bless me if you have no idols. You are blessed and bless others if you do not kill, if you do not covet, those types of things. So this is different than a set of laws that we think about in the West, where if we break a law, we get thrown in prison. See how it's much more relational. So let's now turn to talking about Jesus. Jesus, when asked in Matthew about marriage, tells us the history from Moses that writs of marriage were allowed when cases required them. But that is not the ideal state or path. What God has ordained, let no man separate, is what Jesus says. But we also see the woman a little bit later get caught in adultery and was about to be stoned. And Jesus agreed with the crime, but admonished the crowd that he who is without sin cast the first stone. And they all dropped their stones and left. And he advised the woman to go and sin no more. We also know the story of the woman at the well, where Jesus talks about living water and expresses a deep knowledge of this woman, and finally turns her into the first evangelist, and she goes and tells others about him. So we see people caught in sin and Jesus' compassion. So why would people who are struggling with marriage and decide that they're going to end it be cast out of the church? So recall also that we speak often of the tree of life and good shepherd metaphors, where lost sheep are rescued, given a meal, and told to lay down and rest, even drinking living water. So with all this context, I'll pose the question again. Let's say a family of believers has endured tremendous stress, adversity, and heartache already. Then they must make the public decision to get a divorce. And then they're told that the church no longer supports them. How is the church acting as a good shepherd in this case? What then happens to children who now witness the church abandoning them in their darkest hour? What support will the family turn to? I am a champion of curiosity over judgment. And so questions like, what have you been through to get to this point? Make a safe space for being known for the people who have gone through this dark time. How are your children doing? Is everyone safe? What do you need? There will be time for leading sheep to the path of righteousness. But like everything, there is wisdom in knowing what time it is. Remember that upbringing shapes us. When parents decide to divorce, it's not the ideal path to walk. But what helps people the most? Patience, kindness, love, or judgmental rules? I think you can see the principles LPC uses to comment on how congregations treat families who are walking through a tough path of divorce. Jesus famously told the Pharisees as he was dining with sinners that the sick need a doctor. I never heard Jesus say to lock the sick who are looking for a doctor out in the cold. He only made that admonishment for those who chose to turn their backs on God. And that is different than the church turning their backs on people who then turn their backs on God. So God is eventually does respect some people when they choose to turn their back on him and leave them alone outside of God's presence. But again, this is not what God desires. So it may feel hard to hear that divorce is not the ideal path, but I also don't think it's a foreign thought. What's in terms of what has been termed sin. But sin touches so many aspects of the lives that we live and works in complicated ways and unique ways in all of our lives. And to crystallize around divorce as a reason to kick people out of the church is just not love and is anything but patient and kind. I hope that if you have felt treated in this way, you can see that God wants you close despite the human messaging you have received. If you have been hurt by people using Western church doctrine, I would reconnect with God through the work of thebibleproject.com and walkingthetext.com. Now, on a technical level, most states have no-fault divorce. So the fact that one person files for divorce and the other may be completely willing to stay and work things out. So why does this situation disqualify someone for church support? So as you can see, I'm really not a fan of this idea of kicking someone out because they're getting a divorce. In other work that I've done, I've kind of made a list of how to biblically sort through whether a marriage should continue or not. And the one that seems to apply a lot is if a person becomes, in essence, an unbeliever by continually seeking emotional or harm for the other individual. And so in that circumstance, even though someone hasn't professed that they are no longer a Christian, if they are continually harming another person without any repentance, that in essence can be seen as a spiritual divorce. Again, it's not ideal, but even in the ancient Hebrew setting, Moses was granted the ability to give people divorce even though it was not the ideal circumstance. So now, parenting FAQ number 2. What if my child has already fallen victim to parental alienation syndrome? When we last spoke about PAS, or parental alienation syndrome, I realized that I needed to take another step. And that is, what if your child has already succumbed to fully rejecting you? So first of all, the long-term outlook is actually pretty good, but the emphasis is really on long-term. If you have teenagers, don't really expect them to turn around on their own until their mid-20s. Usually when kids hit their mid-20s, their brains mature and they begin to look at things from their own perspective and not the perspective of the narcissistic parent. Indeed, one of the interview studies that I've read focused on the young adults in this age group. But they were able to share their perspective and realized how wrong it was that what they had been subjected to. But what can be done in the shorter term? So let's talk about this in terms of things that you can do yourself. Number one is don't underestimate or discount the value of prayer. Pray for your ex's heart to soften so that they begin to support you in the eyes of the kids. Pray for your child's heart to soften and for wisdom from God and how to handle the moment-to-moment interactions. So even if you have just a few short moments with your child who has turned their back on you, just pray for courage and wisdom on what to say. And then pray. The other thing that I say to do in this similar way is to call for quiet courage so that you're strong in your position but gentle in delivery, because honestly, any negativity or frustration that you show can and will be very much used against you. And number two, something that is completely within your power to do is to begin a diary for the child who has turned their back on you. And when they reach out, and again, this may be in several years, they may be trying to process a picture of you that causes a lot of anger. One parent that I know is being blamed for keeping the family apart, even though they're not the parent who filed for divorce in the first place. So it can really, really be twisted. So realize that they may be processing a lot of anger at you, or they might feel a lot of shame internally and are actually transferring that shame and anger onto you. So realize that other things might be happening. But have this end in mind, that you can hand them this diary with years of your thoughts and prayers and love about them, and likely they will surely begin to see more of the context. So begin the diary with that end in mind. Share your thoughts and heart and the dreams that you have for your relationship with them. Be honest but not hurtful about serious events. For instance, today I showed up for your concert and you didn't give me a hug. Always remember, sweetheart, I understand how confusing these years must be, and I continue to pray often that we find each other again in a few years and that you can feel safe knowing that you can give and receive hugs from me. But now for the more tricky things, family therapy. The divorce does not change the fact that the parents and the children are still a family unit and must always be allowed to be their authentic selves, which means expressing emotions in a constructive rather than destructive way. So if this is not happening and the kids are rejecting a parent, this is evidence of dysfunction. So individual therapy is not effective in this type of a situation because individuals can build their own stories. And when not taken in the context of the other family members and even potentially disputed and challenged, it's difficult for the individual therapist to make true progress in the overall problems within the home. So again, I recommend group or family therapy. And if things are really bad, you may need to speak to the attorney, friend of the court, or judge, because parental alienation syndrome is mistreatment. And it is kind of like the Helsinki syndrome, where hostages are kind of, they become very sympathetic to the people taking them as hostages, even though they are the aggressors. It's a psychological phenomenon that we know about. But to help the court process, keep a timeline journal about what you're doing. Keep this one factual. I drove my daughter 3 hours so that they could be with the other parent. And I do that every week. And this parent does not drive the daughter to see me or the kiddo to see me. So if there are specific issues, and you can say transfers, those can be addressed by the judge. But the attorney will have to feel out the support from the judge in this circumstance. And I'm going to put a plug in for collaborative divorce proceedings. There is a specified group of attorneys that really work in collaborative fashion for divorce. It's a very good, holistic way to do this. And hopefully during the process, you can build up or bring up the aspect of parental alienation syndrome and what to do if the kids begin to turn away from one of the parents. So I'm going to repeat a message that I said in the last week's podcast, and that is nice guys finished last. Simply being the nice guy will not help parental alienation syndrome. So let's dig a little bit more into this. So what we're looking at in the video of this podcast is a very famous picture that was actually used a lot by Stephen Covey of 7 Habits of Highly Effective People fame. It's an optical illusion or just a complex picture that can be looked at as an old woman or a young woman. The same lines on the page, the same data on the page can be interpreted both ways. And so, but imagine that this dual picture is a portrait of you, or even one of those portraits that shifts a little bit, like you shift it in the light and you can see a demon, and on the other side you can see a nice normal picture. Now, the problem is that when we talk about the parental alienation syndrome, the narcissistic person is venting and potentially even making up this demon-type portrait. And so they have a lot of anger, bitterness, negativity, and so they are going to constantly describe, both either in verbals or nonverbals, some bad aspects of the parent who is the victim of the parental alienation syndrome. And so the children can't help but see this portrait of this parent. So there are good and patient, kind ways to defend yourself as having good sides. And you don't have to be defensive. You can just simply roll forward with, well, there's another way to look at that, and this, that, and the other thing. And you can kind of bring those aspects forward. So remember, the greatest blessings are a balance of loving God, self, and others. So we can kind of get, though, that a selfish person can easily spin boundaries that even protect you as a strong, mature person as selfish. So let's say, nope, I need to pick up the kids at 6 o'clock so that I can get them fed and to bed on normal time. Well, Dad just wants to pick you up at 6 o'clock because he's being selfish. See how that kind of works? So if that narrative is allowed, the children will then kind of slowly begin to believe the negativity. And when you pick them up, and if they seem a bit off about not getting a little bit more time with Mom, you can say, oh, I completely understand that that's where you're coming from. Acknowledge their position. We just have to get dinner and to get settled tonight. And that's why 6 o'clock has to be done that way. So you can oppose this kind of negativity, but with a very clear message, but also delivered in patient and kind tone. But the bigger issue here is that you may not know exactly what is being said. And in those cases, you can see your children turning their back on you. It will feel as if you don't know what's going on, or that they are constantly misreading what it is that you're doing. And so all you can do in these circumstances is make them feel safe to raise concerns, even really, really tough concerns with you. And then treat all of these concerns as important and reserve the leadership role that you have, and really focus on the listening aspect. But also, when it comes down to setting standards and rules, be very authoritative, which means kind, caring, and listening, but yet also able to set down the limits and the rules that help them even thrive. But when this is not possible, write letters to them, or that journal that I talked about, and then continue to push for family and group therapy with a neutral therapist even. I've walked alongside people that have a therapist, and they have a general sense that the therapist is siding constantly with one person or the other. So even this parental alienation syndrome can work in subtle ways with even therapists. So we just have to be very, very careful in how we address that. So next question we're going to deal with is there any way to predict how my child or children will do in both the short or long run after the divorce? And so we're going to spend the rest of today's episode on this question, and it might even bleed into the next episode. I gave a lecture on this basic concept or basic question to a pediatric primary care conference that had over 100 different providers in the room. And I simply asked them to raise their hand if they've ever heard of a lecture telling them how divorce impacts children. And not one hand was raised. So even as a parent, if you don't have a great understanding of how this impacts children, you're not alone. And on a spiritual level, I don't think this is by mistake. I think there's a spiritual war that is waged upon marriage, and the less people know, the more it helps the spiritual war go on. So I'm going to make the answer to this question extraordinarily simple. And there is no way to fully predict how children will do after a divorce. You simply cannot guarantee that the children will be better off or worse off. Now, there are a couple of exceptions. If there is extreme violence, that it's more than likely that kids will do okay. But to counter even that argument, Dr. Wallerstein in her 25-year study talked about a family that when mom and dad would get home every night, they would start to drink, and then they would start to yell, and they would start to fight. But then they would go into the bedroom and have intercourse. And the kids would learn to kind of basically be under a table as all of this fighting was going on. And then they got a divorce eventually. So the current wisdom is, well, this is a good thing for the children because they're no longer exposed to that conflict. But what Wallerstein noted when she followed these children every 5 years is that the relative stability that was in the home was destroyed with the divorce. And so the kids were then exposed to erratic visitation schedules, and even mom had a string of boyfriends that were no better than the original father. So, and also you have the financial instability that comes from that as well. So, am I advocating that this family should have stayed together? Obviously not. But at the same token, it just really puts pause in people's thinking that they're always certain that a divorce is going to make things better for the children. Now, similarly, in sort of this sort of unconventional way of looking at things, she also had families that did everything right, that they were good co-parents, they were good with the child, they were civil and cordial to one another even after the divorce, but the child still grew up having experienced a failed marriage and was very apprehensive and not skilled at having intimate relationships herself. So Wallerstein noted that there is just no way to predict what's going to happen. So whether you're considering a divorce or have already gotten one, what we're going to go through over the next few minutes and slides will hopefully help. But remember that the most important long-term goal is to show or train your child what good and healthy relationships and what a good and healthy marriage looks like. And that does not mean that people never fight and that people never experience challenge or negativity, but that it takes hard work and communication and being honest with your feelings. And some of this wisdom that the children need to have imparted to them also starts with picking a partner, and so that they understand how to assess someone for being a good, having good character and stability for a long-term relationship. And so also this includes being able to look at similar issues differently and negotiate a shared expectation and being able to move forward with that. So it's how they can cooperatively work together in a relationship. And so we want them to emerge from their childhood with this ability to get married if they choose. So that means that we have to put some intention into training them how to be married. And that doesn't necessarily mean you. It could mean some close family member that has a good marriage that you want them to be exposed to. Okay, so the other thing is, before we get too far down, we do need to talk about the aspect of staying together. So if you're in a situation where you're absolutely certain that divorce is needed, Dr. Wallerstein's work shows that children who were matched with very similar parents, but with the parents that chose to stay together and learned to work out their emotional and communication differences, that those children were actually much more resilient when they grew up. So I don't say this to make you feel bad, but I say this to let you know that there are lots of resources out there that if you haven't found them yet, keep looking. There's lots of marriage rescue stories and lots of advice and principles that can be put to bear to help you learn how to get through the dark time that we've talked about as what I call marriage hell, where we are just locked in this crazy cycle of arguing very deeply, fighting all the time, and not feeling listened to. But beyond that, let's talk about some predictive factors as we're moving forward. So first of all, is there big T trauma or little t trauma and open conflict? The basic advice here and what the science tends to show is that kids, when they see open and heavy conflict all the time, that they can understand the reason that mom and dad got a divorce. Now, this is to be contrasted to parents who keep it all locked down, so the kids never know that mom and dad are fighting or having a hard time. So when those kids find out that there's a divorce, they tend to be very blindsided. And those kids will grow up kind of with this sense often that even though things are going good in a relationship, that it could change at any time. So in these types of cases, this is why it's very important that kids be allowed to ask and talk about the reasons for the divorce as they come. And if you kind of even say, no, we did not get along for a long time, but we kept it from you kids. That was something that mom and dad did. I know it maybe seemed like we weren't in a lot of conflict, but we really were. So that's how this open conflict idea can help. But the double-edged sword here is that the kids that see this huge open conflict and that they understand that marriage is, or that marriages can end in divorce, they also tend to undervalue marriage and be quicker to use the mechanism of divorce later on if they need it. So it is kind of a double-edged sword, but that's how you take exposures to big T traumas. These are what are called the ACEs. So obvious abuse, neglect, parental incarceration, divorce in and of itself, violence in the home, alcohol, maternal depression, severe racial inequities, gun violence around the house. Those are big T traumas. Little t traumas are the constant shaming that happens with different relational dynamics, emerging from childhood with a high degree of shame, being told that you have to do things well in order to be loved. Those are little t traumas. And, of course, the amount that those are there and made better by the divorce is important to acknowledge, but it's not as obvious as we might think in terms of reactions. Okay, so next, when we're trying to figure out how kids are doing, the question is, has there been an observable grief reaction? So has your child gone through grief? Have you seen shock, anger, sadness, bargaining, or acceptance? And so what this means is I've asked multiple families over the years, and it's been 5, 6, 7 years since a divorce or even a death in the family. And I'll ask, did you observe any grief reaction in your child? And I'm astounded often that the answer is, well, no. And the problem is that kids don't know what to do with their feelings. So they have to see it demonstrated, and they have to see even others going through it. So as you get sad, it's okay to show that you're sad, but don't lean on the child for help in that particular situation. So this is one of the reasons why in our small group curriculum for Little Pieces Club, we spend several weeks on grief in and of itself, just to educate the kids and teens about the process so that when those feelings begin to bubble up, that they know what they're doing. So this next question is extremely important, and it has to do with caregiving children. And so the question is your child a caregiver child? So parents honestly love caregiver children, but there's many problems that these kiddos contend with. And Wallerstein writes extensively about the caregiving problem in her 25-year study. There was one girl who felt like she had to sit up every night with her mom on the couch because mom was potentially suicidal. And so this child was praised by her mom for being such a mature little girl and really was her rock. So when I hear that parents describe their children as their rock as they're going through a divorce, that is actually not beneficial for the kids' hearts and minds, because it kind of expresses to them that they have to be super mature and that they cannot be children. And that's the problem, is they leave their childhood behind and they don't do the deep social learning that needs to happen when they're a child. And so when they grow up, they apply this dynamic to their spousal situations. And when they have to be the caregiver, you have to realize that the caregiving is very lonely because they don't know how to let someone take care of them. So it becomes a point that needs to be worked on within the marriage. And the most recent thing that I discovered about this is in a lot of the adversity science, people notice, especially like in cancer clinics, that people who are coming in for initial evaluations, the ones who have cancer are the people who are really nice and who put everyone's needs above themselves. Almost it possibly is because their physiology just does not fight for themselves, and that expresses itself in the immune system. The natural killer cells that we rely on to take care of cancer are no longer active because they've gotten put in this mode of other people before myself all the time. And just for a level set and a benchmark, remember, the greatest blessings are love God and others as yourself. So that as is extremely important, as equally as yourself, meaning sometimes you have to be courageously putting yourself out there, and you can't always be in win-lose or lose-win posture. So that's why win-win is actually very biologically, medically important. So what do you do for a child who is a caregiver child? Well, number one, you make sure that you got all your own stuff taken care of. So that means you deal with your own therapist, you lean on close friends, but do not lean on your child. Now, they can see you be sad, and they can even come up to you, and you can even say, no, mommy's very sad because of what's going on, but I will be okay. Try not to lean on your child in this circumstance. Make sure the child understands that you are okay without their intervention. And give them permission to create a safe space for their own needs and desires. Let them know and live out that you and the other siblings don't need them to be the caregiver all the time. Now, it's okay from time to time that a teenager needs to take care of their kids. That's part of being in a family. But to expect it to be a 24/7, 365 thing for that child is what will kind of take them into the caregiver role. Next thing to look for is the ongoing negativity. So how much negativity is being expressed? We touched upon this with the Parental Alienation Syndrome, but it actually implies that one or both parents haven't fully grieved the death of the marriage, and the ongoing bitterness will not serve the needs of the child very well. And this, a lot of kids in these sort of bitter times will even trigger what I call the divorced kid's promise, or what can be thought of more broadly as the adversity promise. I will not let my kids go through this. It's a tremendously heavy burden that a lot of kids will place on their shoulders, and it does, for a time, provide them with a lot of drive to better themselves. And if they are met with good material and education that can help them, it is very important. But at some point, they have to relinquish this promise. Because again, if you're the only one holding on to this promise, it's very lonely. So when they find a potential match or a potential marriage partner, it's very important in the emotional communication that these issues come out and that both partners together take responsibility for avoiding divorce in the future. And so remember also this idea in the background that if kids are seeing this ongoing negativity, it's very important that they be exposed to people with very happy and healthy marriages that can teach them how to express emotions in a constructive way and not necessarily run at the sight of any fight. And then finally, think back, if you're wondering about your children, how was the attachment quality in the first year to 2 years of life? I can tell you just for, in my own marriage, our first child had extremely good attachment because mom and dad were present and doing well. But as our lives got busy, our second child had to deal with the fact that there was already a child in the home. We had lost a pregnancy, and we were a little bit more nervous and stressed the second time around because I was now out of training and having my job as a doctor. So the stress was much, much higher. So the attachment conditions for my second child were not as ideal for my first. And so also look at how well a child bonded with a father figure, how well a child bonded with a mother figure. And that might also help shed some light into how they interact with males and females as they begin friendships in their early teens and teen years. And then just a plug to watch for things from me. I'll be publishing a book in the next few months that's a 40-day devotional on marriage skills, and we talk a lot about attachment. Because the thing to remember with attachment is it is indeed flexible. It can be worked on in later years when maybe times are better. Or more wisdom can be imparted to the kids. So just think through the attachment quality. If it was very poor, then you may have to work harder to help your kids establish good attachments. That can be done with a therapist or other folks. Okay, so we are done with the frequently asked questions. But I do want to give you a recommendation to keep your own journal, as we've talked about. And then in the pages of this journal, to lament and vent about the divorce if you need to lament about anything that you've noticed today that maybe your children are going to have some challenges. And look at these as opportunities for you to help them. So with respect to parental alienation syndrome, it's important to be open and honest with yourself about your own shortcomings. If you vented or done or said things that you shouldn't in front of the kids, it's okay to apologize for your behavior. It's very important to show your children that you can grow and mature and that appropriate apologies are an important part of this process. So write something down that you and or God feel is your shortcoming that you can work on. So first, ask how this might have been helpful or self-protective at one time, and then forgive yourself for continuing to use it. Visualize yourself doing something better in the future, and then decide if you need to make it right in community or apologize overtly, or if just working on it in solitude is good enough. So again, I'm just giving you permission to spend some time in your journal processing some of the things that we go over in this podcast. So Lectio for today is Proverbs 1, verses 5 through 7. I'm going to read it through the first time, and we're going to focus on the last verse, verse 7. And then we'll go through each step after that. So a wise person will hear an increase in learning, and a person of understanding will acquire wise counsel. To understand a proverb and a saying, the words of the wise and their riddles. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. Fools despise wisdom and instruction. So we're focusing on the fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. Fools despise wisdom and instruction. So let's reflect on how this might impact us today. So again, with a lot of these podcasts, they're pretty heavy. I think a lot of parents might be hearing things for the first time. It might be stressful. We might have a tendency to not believe things. But I can tell you, try to understand that these are kind of principles that just help you understand the path and how to chart steps into the future. So let's read this again, and I'll just kind of focus on the last verse. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. Fools despise wisdom and instruction. So as we reflect on how you're going to respond to this, whether it's you're going to take the advice with a good open heart, or if you feel yourself trying to be foolish and reject a lot of what we're talking about, try to promise that you will work against that possibility. But take a moment, I'll pause here for just a second and decide how you need to respond to this idea. So the fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. Fools despise wisdom and instruction. And then finally, I'll read it again for the fourth time, and we get to rest. And however you responded to this verse today, remember that the imagery that we have is of laying down in a field of grass, looking up into the sky, resting our head on God's lap, thanking Him for this intimate experience with His sacred word. So the fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. Fools despise wisdom and instruction. So now we get to close today's episode in prayer. And I again thank you for spending time with this podcast, and I hope it's giving you some very concrete ideas on how to handle situations as they arise with your children. So dear Heavenly Father, despite our chaos, Lord, we know you are in control. We are so blessed that you are our good shepherd and tree of life. Thank you for giving us your wisdom and love so that we can in turn give them to our children. We see your patience and kindness, and we seek to live this out for our children when they are impatient and use strong language. Help us see past the words, especially when they're directed at us, and see right into their hearts that they are just trying to survive. Help us speak to our lost sheep so that they can hear and trust us like we trust you, so that they will heed our words of advice and encouragement and follow our examples. Grant us the wisdom to balance love for you, them, and ourselves. Help us spot parental alienation syndrome. Make us aware if we have been part of it. Help us apologize to our children and be better shepherds and trees of life for them. Seeing our humanity and flaws is okay, and watching us struggle and grow helps our children do the same. So if we have experienced being accused by our church, may we know that you love us, Lord, and that you still provide us with safe refuge in your embrace, and direct us into the loving arms of people who know that we need a good shepherd in this dark time. Help us fix our eyes on building a better future for our children with your help walking alongside us, as it should have been from the beginning. Help fix us to the hope rather than the shame that we naturally fight. Lord, you are the reason that we hope. Your wisdom and love move mountains, and our ears, Lord, are open. Grant us the wisdom to raise our children as trees of life and good shepherds. In your name we pray. Amen. So as I say every time, we are Little Pieces Club Ministries, and we appreciate you spending time with us. Please feel free to like and comment any way you'd like. Send us an email for further questions.